Are you writing down in that book that I'm a pirate?
Well, in a manner of speaking, I suppose one could say that I am, yes.
Good. Because I am. And a damn good one, too.
No, I never flew the skull and crossed bones. That's for your fiction ears. But I have sought pleasure and profit all of my life at sea with no regard for any man's law. That's not to say without morals and standards. I got morals and standards. I never killed anybody that didn't have it coming. I never cheated an honest man, I never pillaged, and I never raped.
I applaud you. Were you ever married?
Welcome to Pretty and Podcast, a podcast mostly about the films of writer and director John Hughes. For this episode, I'll be covering the 1983 New Zealand film Savage Islands, better known as Nate and Hayes, starring Tommy Lee Jones, Michael O'Keefe, and Jenny Seagrove. It was written by David Odell, based on a story by David Odell and Lloyd Phillips, and was at one point given a rewrite by John Hughes. If you've seen the film, and I'm assuming that you have, this film seems like a very un-John Hughes-like film, and there's a very, very good reason for that, which I'll get to. This episode contains spoilers. Savage Islands began as a 24-page treatment by New Zealand producers Lloyd Phillips and Rob Whitehouse, who produced the 1982 cult film Battle Truck. Paramount, Warner Brothers Pictures, and the Ladd Company all rejected the pitch. However, Phillips was determined to see the film made and secured script development funds to hire American writer David Odell, who had written The Dark Crystal and received an Emmy for his work on The Muppet Show. Odell's first draft was well received at Paramount by then president of production Jeffrey Katzenberg, and, according to Phillips, was one of two pirate-themed films considered by the studio that year. The Phillips Whitehouse production, with its initial $6 million budget, and Roman Polanski's Pirates, with a $32 million budget attached. Paramount went with Savage Islands, and increased the budget slightly to $10 million, on the condition that Paramount get final approval of the director. Savage Islands is sometimes wrongly referred to as one of New Zealand's tax shelter films. However, by the time Savage Islands went into production, that loophole in the law had been closed. Savage Islands was New Zealand's most expensive film production at the time. Philip and Whitehouse's first choice to direct was the New Zealand-based director Sam Pillsbury, who directed the 1982 release The Scarecrow, which was known in America by its more cryptic title, Clinham Summer. But the studio and producers eventually settled on Ferdinand Fairfax, who'd recently directed Winston Churchill, The Wilderness Years, a BBC miniseries whose performances were praised, but that People magazine had described as aimless and excruciatingly dull. During the summer of 1982, Tommy Lee Jones and Michael O'Keefe were cast as the titular leads, with actress Jenny Seagrove playing co-star. Tommy Lee Jones, who'd won a Golden Globe for his portrayal of Doolittle Lynn in Coal Miner's Daughter, would play Captain William Bully Hayes. Michael O'Keefe, who was nominated for an Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor for his performance in the 1979 film The Great Santini, would play Nathaniel Nate Williamson, a virtuous divinity student, and Jenny Seagrove, who'd starred in an Academy Award-winning short, A Shocking Accident, would play Nate's fiance, Sophie, no last name. Both director Fairfax and Seagrove, however, were unhappy with Odell's original draft of the script and signed on the condition that the film be rewritten. David Odell had tried several passes at the script, but Fairfax or the producers were still unhappy with the script's ending. By July of that year, while the crew was building sets in shipyards in the Pacific, and with principal photography set to begin on September 7th. With weeks remaining, Paramount Studios brought in another writer. That writer was John Hughes. Hughes had been signed to the studio for multiple scripts beginning in 1981 with the never-produced National Lampoon's The Joy of Sex, A Dirty Love Story. See my National Lampoon's Joy of Sex Parts 2 and 3 for how that turned out. In July 1982, Hughes had been fired or released from the television series At Ease, National Lampoon's Class Reunion, and National Lampoon's Vacation before filming had completed. He was losing control of Mr. Mom, and beyond the several unproduced scripts I've covered in previous installments, Hughes was also working on G.I. Jones, a musical about an Army KP who falls for the general's daughter, Spy vs. Spy, which was possibly based on the Mad magazine strip, and Patagonia, an Indiana Jones-style screenplay that may well have been inspired or been inspiration for Hughes' work on Savage Islands. Regardless, Hughes owed Paramount one more screenplay to complete his contract with the studio. Hughes was an unusual choice for the rewrite. Scenes in Hughes' previous scripts were dialogue-heavy and plot-thin, and the action scenes small and slapstick. Hughes being brought in to fix the third act of a New Zealand pirate-themed action film set on the ocean seems, in retrospect, more about the studio cutting ties with Hughes and a lack of faith in the film than trying to repair Savage Island's third act. In the spring 2013 edition of the Coachella Review, Ross Helford interviewed Savage Island's original screenwriter about his career in a conversation with David Odell. Odell doesn't mince words when talking about what happened to his script for Savage Islands. I've recreated the audio with some heavy edits. In Odell's words, "So Paramount said, oh, wait a minute, John Hughes owes us a commitment. We can get a John Hughes script. They sent him my script and John Hughes did a rewrite in 3 weeks. They sent him a nice 105-page script and he sent back a 250-page script, which of course doubles the budget. So anyway, with like a week to go before shooting started, and I was sitting in the office with the producer and the director and the other producer, the assistant director, and the unit production manager, and the producer said, 'What are we going to do with this script?' And the other producer took it by his thumb and forefinger and held it over the wastebasket and dropped it in. So the director, Ferdinand Fairfax, rewrote the last act and solved, at least in his mind, the technical problems. And the Writers Guild split the credit between me and John Hughes, not a word of whose script had been before the camera. People familiar with the situation were horrified. They didn't use any of his script, and he got half the credit. It was an original script, so a subsequent writer had to do more than 50%. The third act, which was not that different from mine, was maybe 15 or 20% new material, so strictly I should have had sole credit. I don't know what they thought, but I didn't feel like appealing. I was busy writing another movie in London. Also, I was unhappy with some things the director had put in. I wasn't particularly eager to get sole credit and be blamed. But I'm still proud of the structure. Principal photography began on September 13, 1982, and the shooting locations included Auckland and Rotorua and New Zealand, and locations in Fiji. The film follows the adventures of a real-life music hall entertainer, businessman, and ship's captain, Bully Hayes, who operated in the Pacific region from the 1850s until his death on March 31, 1877, when, according to one account, Hayes was shot with a revolver, struck on the skull with an iron implement, and thrown overboard by the ship's cook, Peter Raddick, known as Dutch Pete. Fairfax had described the original script as a reaction to Raiders of the Lost Ark, and felt his revisions gave it a more Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid feel. I'll let David Odell's words describe the film's opening scenes, again from his 2013 interview. The movie starts with a band of pirates coming ashore on a Pacific Island beach and pulling their boat up beyond the waveline and then walking inland. I had thought that was pretty foolproof. You can't really fuck it up. Some nice shots of the surf and the beach, some pirates, some lush jungly foliage. Well, this director had them run across a boa constrictor wrapped around a tree, like with Adam and Eve in the garden, and these tough pirates freak out. These hardened blackguards are terrified of a non-poisonous snake. As they leave, one of the guys picks up the dead snake, and it hangs there completely limp like an old sock. I thought, this director has never killed a snake, or seen it done. Once you kill a snake, it doesn't die immediately. It writhes and thrashes around for a long time. My heart sank. There were many things like that. There's one scene where they're selling arms to the natives who are rebelling against the Spanish Empire. So they deliver the weapons and demand payment, but the natives surround them with spearmen, and Tommy Lee Jones and his crew have to fight their way out of the village. So this director says to me, "What if this tribe was a matriarchy, and the women rule, and the men are all sissy boys, and they wear makeup and perfume and eyeliner, and so Tommy Lee is fighting off a crowd of furious Amazons, and he jumps through the wall of a grass hut, and suddenly he's in the middle of the queen's harem, and one of them flutters his eyelashes at Tommy Lee and says, 'Hello, sailor.'" I told the director I thought the campiness might hurt the plausibility of the action material, and he said to me, "Oh please, it's a fucking pirate movie." After escaping the fictional Moomy tribe, as it's called in the screenplay, Hayes is captured and arrested for selling arms to enemies of the crown, thanks in part to his nemesis Ben Pease, another real-life figure and notorious blackbirder, or slave trader. During Hayes' imprisonment, on the eve of his execution, he's visited by the journalist Lewis Beck, a writer for the Sydney Morning Herald, who asks how Hayes ended up in jail. The film continues in flashback. Hayes, or Tommy Lee Jones rather, with ineffable charm, begins to tell the story of his time on the ship Rona, where he was bringing a young missionary couple to Wakaya Island to a mission station 5 days southeast of Samoa. Those with no knowledge or passing knowledge of Captain Bully Hayes might reasonably assume that the film has some basis in truth. Bully Hayes and Ben Pease, of course, were real men, but so too was the aforementioned writer Lewis Beck. Though Lewis Beck was a writer, he never wrote for the Sydney Morning Herald. He wrote for an Australian magazine, The Bulletin, beginning in 1893, over 20 years after Hayes had died. Beck had once traveled with Bully Hayes aboard his ship the Leonora for a short time in 1874, from January 17th until the Leonora was shipwrecked on March 15th of that same year. Beck's recollections were first recounted in the 1894 book A Modern Buccaneer by Thomas Alexander Brown, who was writing under the name Rolfe Boulderwood. In that book, Hayes is referred to by the pseudonym Haston. But later in life, Beck himself exploited that time he spent with Hayes and wrote about him in The Strange Adventures of James Shervington and Other Stories, Concerning Bully Hayes, and The Wreck of the Leonora, A Memory of Bully Hayes. In researching this episode, I read through several of Beck's works, looking for a story about Hayes that may have provided inspiration for the film. And when I came up empty, I turned to Joan Druitt's 2016 book, The Notorious Captain Hayes. Druitt's book is meticulously researched and exposes a more complete version of Bully Hayes than the Savage Islands Nathan Hayes version captured on film. While Savage Islands acknowledges that Hayes was a bigamist, conman, and music hall performer, it shifts the narrative when the entirely fictional character Nate calls out Hayes for his past crimes of blackbirding and extortion. Hayes, embellishing the story of shooting the balls off Ben Pease, claims that, despite his faults, he, William Hayes, was really the victim. It was, after all, Ben Pease who sets him up for capture. The real Bully Hayes was not a pirate, despite being called one and a habit of dressing the part. He preferred to take ships without violence or force. Hayes was a con man, having more in common with modern white-collar criminals than pirates of his era. Hayes would forge documents to grift men of their ships and cargo, and those he did pay, he'd pay far less than they were owed, if at all. He was a bigamist who was married 3 separate times, and on his voyages, Hayes was known to take an island wife. He'd acquire these island wives by including a young woman or girl in trade negotiations with the islanders, or simply take them by force. There's one particularly disturbing and documented account in Druitt's book of Hayes raping a young Pendjalap girl of about 10 years old, though he'd been accused of raping girls far younger. And while the screenwriters may have been unaware of some of the more disturbing parts of Hayes' past, thanks to an abundance of misleading articles determined to paint Hayes as some kind of hero, even those rose-colored accounts acknowledge Hayes' past of bigamy, minstrelsy, and blackbirding, a form of slave trade prevalent in the Pacific region during the 1860s, where native populations were taken from their islands to work as indentured laborers in sugar, guano, or cotton plantations, through a combination of coercion, trickery, and kidnapping. This practice would displace tens of thousands of Pacific Islanders, and Bully Hayes was one of its best-known practitioners. As such, Savage Islands can really only be seen as a propaganda film that serves to whitewash history. In fact, the New Zealand producers seem to have no problem with Hayes' past. The press package for the film acknowledges that Hayes and Pease were 2 main offenders of the practice of blackbirding. And while it's tempting not to lay blame for the historical inaccuracies of the film at the feet of the American writers or the British director, the final script has named characters like spear chucker and frantic oriental, terms that had long been considered offensive. Even the film's title itself, Savage Islands, is problematic. It would be disingenuous to ignore the racist aspects of the script and film. Though the story of the film has nothing to do with the real-life figures, the producers were certainly interested in the name recognition of Bully Hayes and Ben Pease, at least in the Australasian market, and less concerned with Hayes' past as human trafficker. However, the film isn't all bad. In fact, one surprising detail that Savage Islands seems to get right is in its casting, thanks to a casting department made up of Tom Finlayson, Val Lamond, and Michael Lynch. Tommy Lee Jones is charming as Bully Hayes, and though almost entirely uncredited, it appears that the Pacific Islanders were played entirely by Maori or Fijian actors, including a memorable performance by the musician Prince Tuiteka as King Ponape.
Your Majesty, my country wishes to use your island as an anchorage for its new naval vessels. This is very important for Germany. Very important for me.
How much?
As a small offering, and as an indication of the friendship between our two...
Not enough.
Of course. We have more.
Shrunken heads? Huh? Not enough.
Principal photography was completed by mid-December 1982, 2 weeks behind schedule due mostly to bad weather, accidents, and technical difficulties. The final budget, $12 million. In June 1983, Phipps and Whitehouse held a trade screening in Wellington, New Zealand, but excluded local journalists from the screening, which is never a good sign. Reportedly, the version shown was not the final cut. The film premiered stateside as Nathan Hayes on November 18, 1983, in 925 theaters. Though Variety praised Odell and Hughes for the screenplay, the New York Times called it no fun, and Roger Ebert described it as one of the more inexplicable films I've encountered recently. The film made meager returns, was out of theaters after a 2-week run, and is largely, and rightly, forgotten. Those looking to the film for the contributions of John Hughes may find small moments of the film reminiscent of his work. A line of dialogue here, or a small slapstick moment that feels somehow familiar. But those moments are few, if they can be attributed to him at all. Corroborating Odell's assertion that Hughes had nothing to do with the final cut of the film is Kirk Honeycutt's book, John Hughes, A Life in Film, a thorough exploration of Hughes's film career that has served pretty much as the show Bible for this podcast. Honeycutt's book makes no mention of the film. Pretty in Podcast was written and produced by 517. For more images, information, and sources, see prettyinpodcast.com. And as always, I occasionally go back and update the pages with new information and images, so there may be something new that you might have missed. The theme for the episode is by Brad Davis of Fresh Snow. Check out his band's albums 1. Additional music in this episode was provided by Chris Storrow. This episode also includes sections of the score by Trevor Jones. A CD was released by La La Land Records in 2010, but is sadly out of print. To learn more about the real Bully Hayes, do read Joan Druitt's book, The Notorious Captain Hayes, The Remarkable True Story of the Pirate of the Pacific, available from HarperCollins. It's a fascinating read with some disturbing modern parallels. Also, if there's an aspect of Hughes's work that you'd be interested in knowing more about, send a message. But most importantly, subscribe. I take my time creating episodes for this series, so there's no real schedule for when the next episode will appear in your feed. I'm hoping the long delays between episodes is not nearly as frustrating for you as it is for me. This episode concludes the first phase of John Hughes' career as a writer for the National Lampoon magazine and his multiple failures and limited successes breaking into the film industry. By the time Nathan Hayes was released, in fact, even by the time Mr. Mom and Vacation were released into theaters, those days were behind him. John Hughes was well on his way to the next stage of his career as both writer and director. Next time on Pretty in Podcast, I'll take a look at Hughes' directorial debut, 16 Candles.
16 Candles, a movie about creeps.
Score, a direct hit.
Hunks, hopes, parties.
This is everybody.
Bodies, geeks, clicks.
Yes, I'm back.
So I smell.
And all the terrifying things
Can I borrow your underpants for 10 minutes?
that make life worth living.
Classic.
16 Candles,
This is getting good.
rated PG. Special sneak preview Friday and Saturday night. Check newspaper for theater information.